the Ilkhanate and the transformation of Persia. While Kublai Khan was establishing the Yuan dynasty in China, his brother Hulagu was creating an equally significant but very different Mongol legacy in the Middle East. The Ilkhanate, established by Hulagu Khan in 1256, would preside over one of the most traumatic and transformative periods in the history of Islamic civilization, culminating in events that would reshape the cultural and political landscape of the Middle East for centuries. Hulagu's mission, assigned by his brother Mongol Khan, was deceptively simple: complete the conquest of the Middle East by eliminating the remaining centers of resistance to Mongol rule. In practice, this meant destroying two of the most formidable opponents the Mongols had yet faced: the assassins of Al-Amat and the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad. Both represented not just military challenges, but fundamental threats to the very legitimacy of Mongol rule in the Islamic world. The assassins, more properly known as the Nizari Ismailis, had established a network of mountain fortresses throughout Persia and Syria, from which they conducted a sophisticated campaign of political murder against their enemies. Their leader, known to his followers as the Old Man of the Mountain, commanded absolute loyalty from followers who were willing to undertake suicide missions against seemingly impossible targets. For decades, the mere threat of assassin retaliation had protected their territories from conquest by any power. Hulagu's campaign against the assassins, beginning in 1256, demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of Mongol military methods and their evolution to meet new challenges. The mountain fortresses that had protected the assassins from conventional armies proved vulnerable to the systematic siege techniques that the Mongols had perfected in China and Central Asia. Chinese engineers constructed siege engines capable of hurling projectiles up mountain slopes, while Mongol cavalry controlled the valleys and prevented the supply of the besieged fortresses. More importantly, Hulagu employed psychological warfare with devastating effectiveness against an enemy that had previously relied on their own reputation for inspiring terror. Mongol intelligence networks, often utilizing merchants and travelers sympathetic to their cause, penetrated assassin organizations and created uncertainty about the loyalty of their own members. The systematic destruction of captured assassin strongholds sent a clear message that no fortress was impregnable, and no reputation for invincibility could protect against Mongol determination. The surrender of Alamut, the greatest of the assassin fortresses, in 1256 marked the effective end of the Nizari Ismaili state. The last Grand Master, Rukn al-Din Khorshah, was taken to Mongolia, where he was executed, while the famous library of Alamut, containing irreplaceable manuscripts on philosophy, science, and theology, was destroyed. The elimination of the assassins removed one of the last independent powers in the Middle East and cleared the path for Hulagu's ultimate objective, the conquest of Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliphate, established in 750 CE, represented far more than a political entity to the Islamic world. The Caliph was recognized as the commander of the faithful and the spiritual successor to the Prophet Muhammad, making him the symbolic leader of all Sunni Muslims. Baghdad had served as the capital of the Islamic world for over 5 centuries and was home to the House of Wisdom, one of the greatest centers of learning in human history. By the 13th century, the Abbasid Caliphate had lost most of its temporal power to various successor states and military rulers. However, the symbolic importance of the institution remained enormous, and the Caliph's religious authority was recognized throughout the Islamic world. The destruction of the Caliphate would represent not just a military conquest, but an attack on the very foundations of Islamic civilization. Hulagu's approach to Baghdad revealed both his strategic sophistication and his understanding of the psychological importance of the coming battle. He spent months preparing not just militarily, but diplomatically, securing alliances with Christian rulers in the region who viewed the Mongols as potential liberators from Muslim rule. Armenian and Georgian forces joined the Mongol army, while Hulagu negotiated with Crusader states about potential cooperation against their common Islamic enemies. The siege of Baghdad began in January 1258 and quickly demonstrated the hopeless military situation facing the last Abbasid Caliph, al-Mustasim. The Mongol army, numbering perhaps 150,000 warriors and including the most advanced siege equipment in the world, systematically invested the city and cut off all supply routes. Chinese engineers, now veteran specialists in urban warfare, began the methodical destruction of Baghdad's famous round city walls. Caliph al-Mustasim's response to the crisis revealed both his political naivety and the extent to which the Abbasid court had become disconnected from military realities. He apparently believed that divine protection would preserve his city, while his advisors assured him that the broader Islamic world would rise to defend the caliphate. Neither assumption proved correct, and the caliph's attempts at negotiation only provided the Mongols with additional time to complete their preparations. The fall of Baghdad on February 10, 1258, ranks among the most traumatic events in Islamic history. The systematic destruction that followed was designed not merely to eliminate resistance, but to send a message to the entire Islamic world about the consequences of opposing Mongol rule. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of almost unimaginable devastation as libraries, mosques, palaces and hospitals were systematically destroyed. The House of Wisdom, which had preserved and transmitted Greek philosophy, Persian literature and Islamic science for centuries, was completely destroyed. Manuscripts were thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that observers reported the water running black from ink and red from blood. The intellectual heritage of centuries was obliterated in a matter of days, representing one of the greatest cultural catastrophes in human history. The death of Caliph al-Mustasim marked the formal end of the Abbasid Caliphate and eliminated the institution that had provided spiritual leadership to Sunni Islam for over 500 years. Hulagu's decision to execute the Caliph by wrapping him in a carpet and having him trampled by horses, a method designed to avoid spilling royal blood while ensuring death, was carefully calculated to demonstrate both Mongol power and their understanding of Islamic sensibilities. The destruction of Baghdad had immediate consequences throughout the Islamic world. The loss of the caliphate created a spiritual crisis that reverberated from Spain to Central Asia, while the elimination of Baghdad as a commercial centre disrupted trade networks that had connected Asia, Africa and Europe for centuries. The Mongol conquest had effectively decapitated Islamic political and cultural leadership.
However, Hulagu's establishment of the Ilkhanate also began a process of cultural synthesis that would ultimately transform both the conquerors and the conquered. Unlike the situation in China, where Mongol rulers remained a small minority governing a massive Chinese population, the Middle East presented different challenges and opportunities for Mongol governance. The Ilkhanate controlled territories with enormous cultural and religious diversity, including Persian Zoroastrians and Muslims, Christian Armenians and Georgians, and Jewish communities throughout the region. This diversity required administrative approaches different from those developed in Mongolia or China, leading to innovations in law, taxation, and cultural policy that would influence Middle Eastern governance for centuries. Hulagu himself remained committed to traditional Mongol religious practices and maintained close relationships with Christian communities, partly due to the influence of his wife, Dokuz Khatun, who was a Nestorian Christian. This religious orientation initially created hopes among Middle Eastern Christians that Mongol rule might lead to their liberation from Islamic dominance, while simultaneously creating suspicion and resentment among Muslim populations. The cultural transformation of the Ilkhanate accelerated during the reign of Hulagu's successors, particularly Ghazan Khan, who converted to Islam in 1295. This conversion represented more than a personal religious choice. It marked the beginning of the Mongol ruling elite's assimilation into Persian Islamic culture and the development of a new synthesis that combined Mongol administrative efficiency with Persian cultural traditions and Islamic legal principles. Under Islamic rule, the Ilkhanate became a major patron of Persian literature, art, and architecture, supporting the development of new artistic styles that reflected both Mongol and Islamic influences. The famous Shahnameh manuscript, created during this period, represents one of the finest achievements of medieval Islamic art, while Ilkhanid architectural projects introduced new techniques and decorative elements that influenced building traditions throughout the region. The Ilkhanate's approach to economic policy also reflected the synthesis of Mongol and Persian traditions. They maintained the Mongol emphasis on trade promotion and religious tolerance, while adapting to the agricultural and commercial systems that had developed in the Middle East over centuries. This created a period of economic recovery and cultural flourishing that helped repair some of the damage caused by the initial conquest. However, the Ilkhanate also faced challenges that would ultimately limit its duration and effectiveness. The conversion to Islam, while helping to legitimize Mongol rule among Muslim populations, also created tensions with other Mongol khanates and weakened the cultural bonds that had originally united the Mongol elite. The gradual Persianization of the ruling class reduced their military effectiveness and their ability to maintain the nomadic traditions that had been the source of Mongol strength.
The Ilkhanate would persist until 1335, making it one of the shorter-lived Mongol successor states. However, its cultural and political influence would endure much longer, establishing precedents for the synthesis of nomadic and sedentary governance that would be adopted by subsequent Middle Eastern dynasties. The trauma of the Mongol conquest and the cultural innovations of the Ilkhanate period would fundamentally reshape Persian and Islamic civilization in ways that remained influential well into the early modern period. The Golden Horde and the Mongol yoke over Russia. In the northwestern reaches of the former Mongol Empire, the Golden Horde established a form of rule that would profoundly shape the development of Russian civilization for over 2 centuries. Unlike the direct governmental control exercised by the Yuan dynasty in China, or the cultural synthesis achieved by the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde developed what might be called an extractive imperial system that maintained sharp distinctions between Mongol rulers and Slavic subjects, while creating efficient mechanisms for political control and economic exploitation. The foundation of the Golden Horde's political system was the tributary relationship established between Mongol khans and Russian princes. Rather than replacing existing Russian political structures, the Mongols chose to work through them, requiring Russian princes to travel to Sarai to receive confirmation of their authority and to demonstrate their submission to Mongol supremacy. This system, known as the patent or Yarlik system, gave the Mongols ultimate control over Russian succession, while allowing local rulers to maintain day-to-day governance of their territories. The most important and prestigious of these patents was the Yarlik for the Grand Principality of Vladimir, which carried with it supremacy over other Russian principalities and responsibility for collecting tribute for the Golden Horde. The competition for this position created intense rivalries among Russian princes and prevented the formation of unified resistance to Mongol rule. Princes who proved most reliable in collecting tribute and maintaining order were rewarded with expanded territories and enhanced authority, while those who showed signs of independence faced swift punishment.
This system proved remarkably effective for Mongol purposes. The Russian princes became, in effect, Mongol administrative agents, responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and providing military service when required. The Mongols thus achieved political control over vast territories with minimal direct involvement in daily governance, allowing them to maintain their nomadic lifestyle while extracting maximum benefit from their sedentary subjects. The tribute system established by the Golden Horde was comprehensive and devastating in its economic impact on Russian society. Regular payments included silver, furs, honey, wax, and other valuable commodities, while special levies could be imposed for military campaigns or other extraordinary expenses. Perhaps most traumatic was the requirement for human tribute, young Russian men and women who were taken as slaves or incorporated into Mongol military units. The collection of tribute required the development of sophisticated administrative systems that fundamentally altered Russian political and economic structures. Russian princes had to maintain detailed records of population and resources, establish efficient tax collection mechanisms, and develop the bureaucratic apparatus needed to transfer wealth to their Mongol overlords. These innovations in governmental administration would prove to be important legacies of the Mongol period, contributing to the eventual development of centralized Russian state power. The Golden Horde's military system reflected the unique challenges of controlling vast territories with limited manpower. The core of their army remained traditional Mongol cavalry, but they supplemented these forces with auxiliary troops recruited from subject populations, including Russians, Bulgars, and various Turkic peoples. This created a multi-ethnic military force that could draw upon different tactical traditions and local knowledge while maintaining Mongol command structure and discipline. Russian princes were required to provide military service to the Golden Horde, participating in campaigns against other Mongol khanates, rebellious subjects, or external enemies. This requirement not only provided the Mongols with additional military manpower, but also prevented Russian forces from being used against Mongol rule. Russian military service in Mongol armies exposed Russian warriors to advanced tactical methods and military technologies, contributing to the gradual improvement of Russian military capabilities. The cultural impact of Golden Horde rule on Russian society was complex and multifaceted. Unlike the situation in China or Persia, where Mongol rulers eventually adopted local cultural practices, the Golden Horde maintained its distinct identity while gradually converting to Islam. This religious difference created a permanent cultural barrier between rulers and subjects that reinforced the extractive nature of the relationship. However, the Mongol period also facilitated important cultural exchanges that enriched Russian civilization. Mongol administrative practices influenced the development of Russian bureaucratic traditions, while Mongol legal concepts contributed to the evolution of Russian law. The Mongol emphasis on trade promotion and religious tolerance created opportunities for Russian merchants and facilitated contacts with distant civilizations that would not have been possible under purely European political systems. The Orthodox Church played a crucial role in mediating between Mongol rulers and Russian subjects. The Golden Horde's policy of religious tolerance meant that Orthodox Christianity was not only permitted but actively protected, as church leaders were exempted from taxation and granted significant autonomy in managing their affairs. This policy was strategically motivated. The Mongols recognized that the church provided an important mechanism for maintaining social stability and could serve as an intermediary in their relations with Russian populations. Church leaders like Metropolitan Peter and Metropolitan Alexis became important political figures who negotiated with Mongol Khans on behalf of Russian interests, while maintaining the religious and cultural traditions that preserved Russian identity during the period of foreign rule. The Church's role in preserving Russian culture and mediating political conflicts would prove crucial to the eventual development of unified Russian resistance to Mongol rule. The most significant challenge to Golden Horde authority came from the gradual rise of Moscow as the dominant Russian principality. The princes of Moscow, beginning with Ivan Kalita in the early 13th century, proved particularly skilled at manipulating the Mongol political system to their advantage. By consistently demonstrating loyalty to the Golden Horde and efficiency in tribute collection, Moscow's rulers gradually accumulated additional territories and enhanced authority over other Russian principalities. The success of Moscow's strategy reflected important changes that were occurring within the Golden Horde itself. As the Khanate became increasingly settled and Islamic in character, its rulers became less capable of maintaining the military effectiveness and political unity that had characterized earlier Mongol rule. Internal conflicts between rival claimants to the throne weakened central authority, while the conversion to Islam created tensions with traditional Mongol culture and political practices. The Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, where Dmitry Donskoy of Moscow defeated a Golden Horde army led by Mamai, marked a crucial turning point in Russian-Mongol relations. While the victory did not immediately end Mongol rule, Moscow was sacked by Toktamish just 2 years later. It demonstrated that Mongols' military supremacy was no longer absolute and inspired growing confidence in the possibility of independence. The gradual decline of the Golden Horde in the 14th and 15th centuries resulted from a combination of internal political conflicts, external military pressures, and the changing balance of power in Eastern Europe. The rise of Lithuania as a major regional power, the expansion of Polish influence, and the growing strength of Moscow all contributed to the fragmentation of Golden Horde authority. Perhaps most importantly, the Golden Horde's success in extracting wealth from its Russian subjects ultimately contributed to its downfall. The tribute system had strengthened and enriched Russian principalities like Moscow, providing them with the resources needed to challenge Mongol rule. The administrative systems developed to serve Mongol interests were gradually turned to serve Russian purposes, while the military experience gained through service to the Golden Horde enhanced Russian capabilities for independent action. The formal end of Golden Horde rule over Russia came in 1480, when Ivan III of Moscow refused to pay tribute and successfully resisted military pressure from Khan Ahmad. This event, known as the Great Stand on the Ugro River, marked the end of over 2 centuries of Mongol domination and the emergence of an independent Russian state that would eventually become one of the world's great powers. The legacy of Golden Horde rule profoundly influenced subsequent Russian political development in ways that remained evident for centuries. The centralized autocratic traditions that characterized Imperial Russia owed much to administrative practices developed during the Mongol period, while Russian expansion into Central Asia and Siberia reflected lessons learned about governing diverse populations across vast territories. More fundamentally, the experience of foreign rule had created a Russian political culture that emphasized the importance of strong central authority, the subordination of individual interests to state needs, and the necessity of maintaining military readiness against external threats.
These characteristics, forged during the Mongol period, would become defining features of Russian civilization that persisted well into the modern era. The Golden Horde thus represents a unique model of nomadic imperial rule that successfully adapted to the specific challenges of governing settled populations while maintaining nomadic identity and culture. While it ultimately failed to create the lasting cultural synthesis achieved by other Mongol khanates, its influence on the development of Russian civilization was profound and enduring, demonstrating the remarkable adaptability and lasting impact of Mongol imperial innovations. The decline and fall of the Mongol Empire. The decline of the Mongol Empire was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual process that unfolded over nearly 2 centuries as the various khanates faced internal divisions, external pressures, and the fundamental challenges of maintaining nomadic rule over increasingly sedentary populations. The story of this decline reveals both the inherent strengths and ultimate limitations of the world's largest contiguous land empire. By the late 13th century, the cracks in the Mongol imperial system were becoming increasingly apparent. The unity that had characterized the empire under Genghis Khan and his immediate successors had been replaced by rivalry and occasional warfare between the different khanates. The Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia were developing distinct identities and pursuing conflicting policies that undermined the coherence of Mongol rule. The fundamental challenge facing all Mongol rulers was the tension between their nomadic heritage and the requirements of governing sedentary societies. The military and administrative systems that had made the Mongols so successful in conquest proved less suitable for long-term governance of complex agricultural and commercial societies. Each khanate attempted to resolve this tension in different ways, with varying degrees of success and unintended consequences. The Yuan dynasty in China faced perhaps the most complex challenges, as Kublai Khan's successors struggled to maintain the delicate balance between Mongol identity and Chinese administrative necessities. The dynasty's later rulers became increasingly Chinese in their outlook and practices, which enhanced their legitimacy among Chinese subjects but alienated traditional Mongol elites who viewed this cultural assimilation as a betrayal of their heritage. The succession system proved particularly problematic for the Yuan dynasty. Unlike the relatively stable succession arrangements that had characterized earlier Chinese dynasties, the Mongol system of election by Kurultai was poorly suited to the complexities of governing a vast sedentary empire. Succession disputes became increasingly frequent and violent, disrupting imperial administration and providing opportunities for Chinese resistance movements to gain strength.
Economic problems also mounted steadily during the later Yuan period. The costs of maintaining the imperial court in Beijing, funding frequent military campaigns, and supporting a vast bureaucracy gradually exceeded the dynasty's revenues. The government's response, printing additional paper money to meet fiscal shortfalls, led to severe inflation that undermined confidence in imperial currency and disrupted commercial activities throughout China. Natural disasters during the 14th century exacerbated these economic problems and created conditions that favored rebellion against Mongol rule. Floods along the Yellow River displaced millions of people and destroyed agricultural infrastructure, while droughts and famines reduced tax revenues and increased the burden of supporting refugee populations. These disasters were interpreted by many Chinese as signs of heaven's displeasure with foreign rule, lending religious legitimacy to anti-Mongol movements. The rise of Chinese nationalist movements during the 14th century reflected both the weakening of Mongol administrative capacity and the persistence of Chinese cultural identity despite centuries of foreign rule. Secret societies like the Red Turbans combined traditional Chinese religious beliefs with anti-Mongol political objectives, creating powerful ideological frameworks that could mobilize widespread resistance. The rebellion that ultimately overthrew the Yuan dynasty was led by Zhu Yuanzong, a peasant who rose through the ranks of rebel movements to become Emperor Hongwu of the Ming dynasty. His success demonstrated both the effectiveness of Chinese resistance strategies and the extent to which Mongol military superiority had declined by the mid-14th century. The Ming armies that captured Beijing in 1368 employed tactics and technologies that the Mongols themselves had introduced to China, turning Mongol innovations against their creators. The Ilkhanate in Persia faced different but equally serious challenges during the same period. The conversion of the Mongol ruling elite to Islam, while helping to legitimize their rule among Persian and Arab subjects, also created new sources of conflict and instability. The adoption of Islamic legal and administrative practices conflicted with traditional Mongol customs, creating tensions within the ruling elite that weakened central authority. The Ilkhanate's economic problems were exacerbated by the damage that Mongol conquests had inflicted on the region's infrastructure. The destruction of irrigation systems during the initial invasion had never been fully repaired, limiting agricultural productivity and reducing the tax base available to support imperial administration. The decline of Baghdad as a commercial center and the disruption of traditional trade routes further reduced the resources available to Ilkhanate rulers. Internal succession disputes became increasingly frequent and destructive as different factions within the Mongol elite competed for control over diminishing resources and faced growing external pressures. The conversion to Islam had not eliminated traditional Mongol succession practices, creating confusion about legitimate authority that various claimants could exploit. These conflicts often involved external powers, including other Mongol khanates and local Persian and Arab rulers, further fragmenting political authority. The final collapse of the Ilkhanate in 1335 resulted from a combination of succession disputes, economic problems, and the rise of regional powers that no longer recognized central authority. The fragmentation that followed created a power vacuum that was filled by various local dynasties, none of which possessed the resources or legitimacy needed to reunify the region under stable rule. The Golden Horde's decline followed a somewhat different pattern, reflecting the unique characteristics of its political system and geographic environment. The Horde's reliance on tribute from sedentary subjects made it vulnerable to changes in the balance of power between nomadic rulers and settled populations. As Russian principalities like Moscow grew stronger and more unified, they became less willing to accept Mongol domination and more capable of resisting it. The conversion of the Golden Horde to Islam during the 14th century, while strengthening ties with other Muslim states, also created cultural distances from their Christian subjects that made political accommodation more difficult. The religious divide reinforced the extractive nature of the relationship and prevented the kind of cultural synthesis that might have created more stable foundations for long-term rule. Internal conflicts within the Golden Horde became increasingly severe during the 14th and 15th centuries, as different factions competed for control over diminishing resources and faced growing external pressures. The rise of Lithuania, the expansion of Polish influence, and the growing strength of Moscow all contributed to the fragmentation of Mongol authority in Eastern Europe. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia faced perhaps the most difficult challenges of all the Mongol successor states. The region's location made it vulnerable to attacks from all directions, while its diverse population and complex geography made effective governance extremely difficult. The gradual conversion to Islam created new sources of legitimacy, but also new sources of conflict, as traditional Mongol customs clashed with Islamic legal requirements. The fragmentation of the Chagatai Khanate into eastern and western portions during the 14th century reflected these fundamental governance problems. Neither successor state possessed the resources or administrative capacity needed to maintain effective central control, leading to further fragmentation and the rise of local rulers who acknowledged Mongol authority only nominally. The rise of Timur, or Tamerlane, in the late 14th century represented both a continuation and a transformation of Mongol imperial traditions. While Timur claimed descent from Genghis Khan and employed many traditional Mongol military techniques, his empire was based more on Persian and Islamic foundations than on genuine Mongol political culture. His conquests demonstrated that the Mongol military tradition remained potent, but also that it was becoming separated from its original cultural and political context.
By the 15th century, the great age of Mongol imperial power was clearly coming to an end. The Yuan dynasty had been replaced by the Ming in China. The Ilkhanate had fragmented into numerous successor states. The Golden Horde was declining rapidly under pressure from Moscow and other regional powers, and the Chagatai Khanate existed only as a collection of competing local dynasties. Several factors contributed to this general decline. The gradual sedentarization of Mongol elites reduced their military effectiveness and their connection to the nomadic traditions that had been the source of their strength. The adoption of local cultural and religious practices, while sometimes enhancing legitimacy, also weakened the cultural unity that had originally bound the empire together. More fundamentally, the Mongol Empire had been created during a unique historical moment when the military advantages of nomadic cavalry were at their peak before the development of gunpowder weapons and other military innovations that would reduce the effectiveness of traditional steppe tactics. By the 15th century, sedentary states had learned to counter nomadic military advantages through improved fortifications, better trained infantry, and early firearms that could neutralize cavalry charges. The economic foundations of Mongol rule also proved unsustainable in the long term. The empire's wealth had been based primarily on conquest and tribute rather than on productive economic activities. Once the era of expansion ended, the Mongol states struggled to develop alternative economic foundations that could support their extensive administrative and military establishments. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongol Empire had never developed effective solutions to the problems of imperial succession and administrative continuity. The traditional Mongol system of succession through Kurultai was poorly suited to governing vast sedentary empires, while the adoption of local succession practices often conflicted with Mongol traditions and created opportunities for political instability. The decline of the Mongol Empire marked the end of the last great nomadic empire in human history. The rise of gunpowder weapons, improved agricultural techniques, and more sophisticated state administrative systems gradually shifted the balance of power from nomadic to sedentary societies. The age of nomadic empire building that had begun with the Xiongnu and reached its apex with the Mongols was finally drawing to a close. However, the legacy of the Mongol Empire would endure long after its political fragmentation. The cultural exchanges facilitated by Mongol rule had created networks of communication and trade that continued to function even after the empire's collapse. The administrative innovations developed by Mongol rulers influenced governmental practices across Eurasia for centuries, while the trauma and transformation of Mongol conquest left lasting marks on the civilizations they had ruled. The Mongol Empire's rise and fall represented one of the most remarkable episodes in human history. The creation and destruction of the world's largest contiguous land empire by a people who had emerged from the margins of civilization to reshape the entire known world. Their story demonstrates both the tremendous potential for historical change inherent in nomadic societies and the ultimate limitations that prevented such societies from creating lasting institutional foundations for their remarkable military achievements.
The Mongol legacy in world history. As we reach the end of our journey through the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire, it is worth reflecting on the extraordinary impact that this nomadic confederation had on the course of world history. From their origins as fragmented tribes on the Mongolian steppes to their establishment of the largest contiguous land empire in human history, the Mongols fundamentally altered the political, cultural, and economic landscape of Eurasia in ways that continue to influence our modern world. The Mongol achievement was unprecedented in both its scope and its speed. In less than a century, beginning with Genghis Khan's unification of the Mongol tribes in 1206, they conquered territories stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, from Siberia to Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent. No other empire in history achieved such extensive territorial control, and none expanded with such remarkable velocity across such diverse geographic and cultural terrain. Perhaps most remarkably, this vast empire was created by a people who began as one of the world's most marginal societies. The Mongols had no cities, no written language, no sophisticated technology, and no apparent advantages over the great civilizations they would eventually conquer. Their success demonstrates the importance of social organization, military innovation, and strategic leadership in determining historical outcomes, even when facing seemingly overwhelming disadvantages in population, resources, and technological sophistication. The Mongol military system represented one of the most significant innovations in the history of warfare. Their combination of mobility, organization, psychological warfare, and adaptability proved superior to every military force they encountered, from the heavy cavalry of medieval Europe to the sophisticated siege warfare capabilities of Song Dynasty China. The decimal system of military organization, the use of composite bows, the emphasis on intelligence gathering, and the integration of siege warfare technologies from conquered peoples created a military machine that remained undefeated for over a century. But the Mongols' impact extended far beyond military conquest. Their empire created the first truly global system of communication, trade, and cultural exchange in human history. The Pax Mongolica enabled unprecedented levels of interaction between civilizations that had previously remained largely isolated from one another. Merchants, missionaries, scholars, and artists traveled freely across the empire, carrying goods, ideas, and technologies that enriched all the civilizations under Mongol rule. The famous Silk Road reached its zenith during the Mongol period, as trade routes that had previously been disrupted by warfare and political instability became secure highways protected by imperial authority. Chinese silk reached European markets, Islamic mathematical and astronomical knowledge spread to China and Europe, and gunpowder technology traveled from China to transform warfare across Eurasia. The economic integration facilitated by Mongol rule created the foundation for what we might recognize as the first global economy. The Mongol postal system, known as the Yam, revolutionized long-distance communication and established precedents for imperial administration that influenced governmental practices for centuries. Messages could travel from one end of the empire to the other in weeks rather than months, enabling a level of administrative coordination that had never before been possible across such vast distances. Religious and cultural tolerance was another crucial aspect of the Mongol legacy. Unlike many empire builders who attempted to impose their own religious and cultural practices on conquered peoples, the Mongols generally pursued policies of accommodation and synthesis. This tolerance was partly pragmatic. They were too few in number to impose uniformity on such diverse populations. But it also reflected a sophisticated understanding of imperial governance that recognized the importance of legitimacy and consent in maintaining long-term political stability. The consequences of this tolerance were profound and lasting. In China, the Yuan dynasty facilitated cultural exchanges that enriched Chinese civilization with influences from across Eurasia. In Persia, the Ilkhanate patronized a synthesis of Mongol, Persian, and Islamic traditions that produced remarkable achievements in art, architecture, and scholarship. Even in Russia, where Mongol rule was more extractive, the experience of foreign domination and cultural contact had lasting influences on Russian political and cultural development.
The Mongol conquest also had devastating consequences that must be acknowledged alongside their positive contributions. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258 eliminated one of the world's greatest centers of learning and effectively ended the Islamic Golden Age. The systematic destruction of irrigation systems in Central Asia and Persia caused environmental damage that has never been fully repaired. The human cost of Mongol conquest was enormous, with some regions losing the majority of their populations to warfare, disease, and displacement. These destructive consequences reflect the fundamental tension between the Mongol military culture that enabled their conquests and the requirements of governing the sophisticated civilizations they conquered. The same ruthlessness and systematic approach that made them militarily invincible also led to unprecedented levels of destruction when cities and regions offered resistance. The demographic impact of the Mongol conquests was staggering and long-lasting. Historical demographers estimate that the population of the Khwarezmian Empire may have declined by as much as 75% during the Mongol conquest, while China's population dropped from over 100 million to perhaps 60 million during the Yuan period. These population declines were caused not only by direct violence, but also by the disruption of agricultural systems, the spread of diseases along trade routes, and the social and economic chaos that accompanied conquest. Yet the Mongol Empire also demonstrated remarkable adaptability and innovation in addressing the challenges of governing diverse populations across vast distances. Each of the successor khanates developed distinct approaches to imperial governance that combined Mongol traditions with local practices, creating new forms of political organization that influenced subsequent historical development. The Yuan dynasty's synthesis of Mongol military traditions with Chinese administrative sophistication created governmental institutions that the Ming dynasty largely preserved and that influenced Chinese political development for centuries. The Ilkhanate's patronage of Persian culture and eventual conversion to Islam established precedents for cultural accommodation that influenced subsequent Middle Eastern dynasties. Even the Golden Horde's extractive system of indirect rule contributed to the development of centralized autocratic traditions that became characteristic of later Russian political culture. The scientific and technological exchanges facilitated by Mongol rule had revolutionary consequences that extended far beyond the empire's political boundaries. The transmission of gunpowder technology from China to Europe fundamentally altered the nature of warfare and contributed to the rise of early modern European states. The spread of printing technology, mathematical innovations, and astronomical knowledge accelerated intellectual development across Eurasia and laid important groundwork for later scientific revolutions. Medical knowledge also benefited enormously from the cultural exchanges enabled by Mongol rule. Chinese medical techniques reached the Islamic world, while Islamic and Persian medical traditions were transmitted to China and Europe. The synthesis of different medical traditions that occurred during the Mongol period contributed to advances in surgery, pharmacology, and diagnostic techniques that saved countless lives and enhanced human health. However, the same trade routes that facilitated these beneficial exchanges also enabled the rapid transmission of diseases that had devastating consequences for human populations. The Black Death of the 14th century, which killed perhaps one-third of Europe's population and caused massive mortality throughout Asia, was likely transmitted along the trade networks that the Mongol Empire had created and protected. The environmental impact of Mongol rule was complex and varied significantly between different regions. In some areas, particularly those that had resisted conquest, the systematic destruction of agricultural infrastructure caused environmental degradation that persisted for centuries. The abandonment of irrigation systems in Central Asia transformed formerly fertile regions into deserts, while the destruction of cities eliminated the concentrated populations needed to maintain complex agricultural systems. In other regions, however, the Mongol rule may have had positive environmental consequences.
The depopulation caused by conquest allowed forests to regenerate in some areas, while the Mongol emphasis on mobility and their traditional nomadic lifestyle prevented the kind of intensive agriculture that might have caused soil exhaustion or deforestation. The linguistic legacy of the Mongol Empire is still visible today in the numerous languages across Eurasia that contain Mongol loanwords. Russian, Persian, Turkish, Chinese, and many other languages incorporated Mongol terms related to government, military affairs, and trade that continue to be used centuries after the empire's collapse. The Mongolian script, adapted from the Uyghur alphabet, influenced the development of several other writing systems and remained in use for Mongolian itself until the 20th century. The legal traditions established during the Mongol period also had lasting influence on subsequent political development. The Mongol law code known as the Yasa introduced concepts of religious tolerance, merit-based promotion, and systematic legal procedures that influenced legal development across the empire. While the specific provisions of the Yasa were often modified or abandoned as the Khanates adapted to local conditions, its underlying principles continued to influence legal thinking for generations. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongol Empire demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of pre-modern globalization. For approximately 2 centuries, much of the inhabited world was connected by political, economic, and cultural networks that enabled unprecedented levels of exchange and interaction. This experience of connectivity and cultural synthesis created expectations and institutions that persisted even after the empire's political fragmentation. The collapse of Mongol unity in the 14th and 15th centuries marked the end of this early experiment in globalization, but it did not eliminate the networks and relationships that had been created. Trade routes continued to function, cultural exchanges persisted, and the knowledge gained through Mongol-facilitated interactions continued to influence development across Eurasia. The Mongol legacy is also visible in the political geography of the modern world. The territorial boundaries established by the various khanates influenced the development of later nation-states, while the cultural syntheses achieved during the Mongol period contributed to the formation of distinct national identities that persist today. The modern states of Mongolia, China, Iran, and Russia all bear the marks of their experiences under Mongol rule, both in their political institutions and in their cultural traditions. In conclusion, the Mongol Empire represents one of the most remarkable episodes in human history, a demonstration of how a small, marginal society could, through extraordinary leadership, military innovation, and cultural adaptability, reshape the entire known world. Their achievement was not merely of conquest, but of creating new forms of political organization, facilitating unprecedented cultural exchanges, and establishing the foundation for what we might recognize as the first global civilization. The rise and fall of the Mongol Empire teaches us important lessons about the nature of historical change, the relationship between nomadic and sedentary societies, and the possibilities and challenges of governing diverse populations across vast territories. Their story reminds us that historical outcomes are not predetermined by geography, population, or technology, but can be dramatically altered by human agency, innovation, and the unpredictable dynamics of political and military competition. Most importantly, the Mongol Empire demonstrates that the most powerful and seemingly permanent political institutions are subject to change and eventual dissolution. The same forces of cultural adaptation, political fragmentation, and technological innovation that enabled the Mongols to create their empire ultimately contributed to its decline and fall. This pattern of rise and decline reflects broader rhythms in human history that continue to shape our modern world.
The Mongols emerged from the steppes as one of history's most unlikely conquerors and created an empire that connected civilizations, transformed cultures, and established precedents for global interaction that continue to influence our interconnected world today. Their legacy reminds us that the margins of civilization can sometimes become its center, and that the most profound historical changes often come from the most unexpected sources. In our modern age of globalization, technological connectivity, and cultural exchange, we can perhaps better appreciate the remarkable achievement of the Mongols in creating the world's first truly global empire. Their story continues to offer insights into the challenges and opportunities of managing diversity, facilitating exchange, and maintaining political unity across vast distances and cultural differences. The Mongol Empire may have ended centuries ago, but its influence on the development of our modern world remains profound and enduring.